and welcome to another special installment of Liberty Nation's Swamponomics videocast. I'm Andrew Moran, Allen's economics correspondent. Each week, I dive into the moors of top economic news stories and fish out compelling narratives, or I retrieve fallacies that have been accepted as conventional wisdom by the swamp creatures for years. This week, can the United States dollar survive the President Joe Biden era and the inflation tsunami? Over the last 12 months, the Federal Reserve has printed approximately 1/4 of all US dollars ever created, and counting. The US Central Bank unleashed the mother of all bombs in 2020, and the century-old institution continues to fire off missiles to fend off the negative effects of the coronavirus pandemic. The Eccles Building is also bailing out Uncle Sam by monetizing the astronomical levels of spending that have occurred since COVID-19 slammed into the United States. Both President Biden presenting trillions of dollars in new spending with only a few months since arriving to the Oval Office, in addition to the trillions of dollars already on the books, can the greenback survive Bidenomics? Are we in store for an inflation tsunami that will permanently flood the US economy? What is the future of fiat money? Here to discuss further is my guest, Mr. Mike Manciel, the editor, publisher, and host of Rethinking the Dollar. Welcome to the program, sir.
Andrew Moran, I appreciate you for inviting me to this opportunity here. Looking forward to share my 2 cents as well as, trying to navigate through these choppy waters, my friend. Thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So let's dive deeper into the current situation. The Fed is calling the current wave of inflation, quote, transitory. The White House agrees that the current push inflation will be short-lived. But billionaire investor Warren Buffett warned that prices are going, quote, up, up, up. Financial markets seem also concerned about inflation. So, who is right? Is inflation here to stay, or will it be as brief as a toilet paper shortage last year?
That's a lot of unpacking that one question there. But as far as inflation, it definitely is here to stay. It's not going anywhere rather. And I believe it's going to go a lot higher, probably a lot faster rate than we all anticipated. And a lot of that has to do with what I call the collision of monetary and fiscal policy. And so, as you mentioned before in the introduction, there's been an unprecedented amount of reserve creation as well as fiat currency creation as well, at the same time that our entire monetary system is based upon the idea of inflating the monetary base in order to prop things up and to keep things afloat. And so it's no way that the finite amount of goods and services in existence will not increase in nominal terms because of the amount of currency circulating around, looking to be stored into those instruments. So it's just a matter of time, and currency will destroy this monetary system, and inflation will become a severe problem globally, I think.
Now, what do you think of the central bank's explanation about the whole rising inflation in the coming months? They say that has more to do with the reopening of the economy and then a variety of other factors such as, simultaneous global demand and supply shortages. Does that have more to do with the rising inflation, or is it more of the monetary expansion?
I think it plays a part in the rising inflation coming up, because last year doing something completely unheard of, which is locking down an entire economy, basically bringing everything to a halt, created a jolt to the system to where the response to that led to all that monetary creation. And then if everything is shut down, no one's spending, everyone's told to stay home and do certain things and whatnot. Once people get that sense of freedom to where they're able to leave their house and have more confidence, rather, to get back out and spend, as the narrative of going back to normalcy comes into play, more people will spend. Therefore, all that currency that was created and sent out in the form of stimulus checks and unemployment and all excess of unemployment and things like that, it will make its way into the main economy. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a finite amount of goods and services, which has not increased, but yet the currency has increased. So definitely it will lead to higher prices on the shelves. And I think right now we're witnessing that, especially here in the US. And so, yeah, it's here.
So that ties into my next question. So both consumer and producer prices are on an upward trajectory. Food prices are soaring to record highs. Raw materials are climbing. Energy is making a comeback. So whether inflation is a permanent fixture of the US economy or it's a blip on the radar, how much higher do you think inflation will go? Today, the annual inflation rate stands at 2.6% as of March 2021. Do you think it could exceed 5%? Could it reach double digits? How high are we going here?
Okay, so the fact that the number you share, 2.6, it all boils down to if you believe that number in its entirety, given the source of it. And so assuming that it comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the government itself or the Federal Reserve, then that's definitely not as high as it is on Main Street, where you look at the actual cost, given the things you just mentioned. So I like to use different metrics to measure what the inflation possibly could be. And the Chapwood Index with Ed Butowski, which happens to be a very good indicator based upon the average cost of living in all the items that we use on a day-to-day basis. And within the metro area of Detroit, I want to say last time I checked, it's like closer to 8%, if not 9%. And of course, Los Angeles, a lot higher. In New York, a lot higher than that. And then also John Williams from Shadow Stats does a good job of collecting data as well, based upon the pre-81 or 82 CPI change. And he's also looking at about 8 or 9%. So just those two alternative sources is a lot higher than that 2.6 or whatever the Federal Reserve might want to use as their measuring standard. So it's definitely a lot higher to that. And I would prefer to go with those alternative sources for possible numbers as opposed to the official government numbers that it's low in their interests and betters their position than it does we the people. So it's probably going to go a lot higher than that as well.
Yeah, I find it interesting how the government can suppress actual numbers by just manipulating the data points, because they do the same thing with the labor numbers. I read the book Lies, Damn Lies, and the Statistics. So
right. So
over the last month, the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada announced tapering of the respective quantitative easing plans. The OC is reducing about $1 billion from its $4 billion a week bond buying efforts. The BOE is cutting its new bond purchasing rate by about $1 billion, although Central Bank Chief Andrew Bailey dismissed the tapering description. So whatever the case, what kind of environment do you think this will create? Could it create a situation whereby inflation is still high, but without this monetary support, the economy would be sluggish? So you have a case of either stagflation or stagnation. What's your take on the tightening occurring worldwide?
Well, the idea of tapering sounds good in theory because it helps the narrative of we're recovering. Things are getting back to normal. But yet also the idea of tapering will probably cause a little bit of jitters in the financial markets, because a lot of the market's confidence is built upon the fact that they'll have some support from the government if things get a little rocky. And so I think we'll have a little bit of both, a little bit of stagflation ultimately, because a lot of the damage has already been done, I think, with the excess of creation of currency. I hear in the U.S. with over 6 trillion or so been brought to existence, that's out there in some capacity, as well as all the excess savings that will eventually be let out into the mainstream economy, whether it's UK or Canada and the US. We're all kind of in the same boat there. And so I think prices will continue to go up. But then again, also, when it comes to moratoriums and all the debt obligations not being met, that's going to cause problems. So I don't see the idea of tapering being something that they can continue to run with, but I think they'll try it just so they can continue to promote that real recovery narrative. And then, like always, typically you get through a couple of weeks or so or months, and then something happens unexpectedly. Then they say, we tried, we were on the right course, and then this event happened or that event happened. So we need to now go back to that and probably increase it a little bit more. And then, of course, they'll start it back over again, because we're currently on a perpetual wheel of debt. The only way this thing can continue on is if there's support. And the support, unfortunately, will come from governments needing to borrow and central banks needing to monetize. And so it's inevitable. It's baked into the cake. But I guess on paper, it sounds good. And for the untrained eye, they might even believe it. But for those who pay attention and really know where this is heading, I don't buy it one bit. So it sounds good on paper, though.
Recently, U.S. Treasury Secretary and former Fed Chair Janet Yellen, she stated that a rate hike would be necessary to cool an overheated economy, and that the markets immediately declined on the news. However, Fed Chair Jerome Powell, he reassured everyone by saying, quote, that he isn't thinking about raising rates. And then following the April jobs report, Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari, he said that there isn't going to be any easing anytime soon because the U.S. economy is a long way to go. So you alluded to this previously, but in your mind, does this suggest that the stock market is over-reliant on easy money, and then any sort of tightening would result in a reversal of the market's monumental gains? So could there be flash crashes? Could there be massive declines in the NASDAQ and the Dow Jones if the Fed were to taper even by, let's say, $50 billion, or no, let's go lower, $10 billion of its monthly QE purchases?
I would imagine so, because if we look at what's happened over the last decade plus since the great financial crisis, where QE 1, 2, 3, pretty much were they went hand in hand with the increase of all the equity markets. And when they began the tapering process, I think we got through maybe like not even a year, give or take. And then they realized they could not do it because the monetary system pretty runs upon, excess reserves being created and pumped out into the system. So all the markets responded very negatively when they called themselves tightening, to where they had to get back into the game. And therefore, here we are again, doing more of the same. And what we can learn from the prior experience with that tightening attempt is that it cannot be temporary, because the economy is built upon it now. And the only way the markets tend to go to all-time new highs is if there is some type of currency creation that provides the liquidity for all of this malinvesting. So it's unfortunate that it's becoming more and more obvious that in order for this to continue to go on, for things to continue to increase in nominal terms, that they have to be the pushers of the economy with this, bond buying purchase program. So it's a part of the program. And then to speak on Yellen, I think she misspoke, because she was probably thinking from her chairwoman position from years back, to where she said that the need to raise rates will be something we might consider or need to do. And then, of course, she probably was brought back into line with what the overall agenda was. And Jerome Powell came out and said that, no, we're fine and good. So that shows the disconnect between the Treasury and the Fed right there, because that, to me, was a complete example of them slipping up, not being in sync with their speak for the public. And it basically showed that there's no way they can raise rates in a natural environment, because it would put more of a burden on Uncle Sam and being able to carry that debt load. So I don't see that happening no time soon. And if things get out of control and they're forced to, I think the global economy will be in for a rude awakening, because we are the reserve currency, and it'll show that we're no longer able to live up to those obligations. So it'll be problematic for everybody.
And that was interesting on the Dow Jones pre-market trading on the Friday after the jobs report. It was down about 150, 200 points. And then at the opening bell, as soon as Kashkari says, "Oh yeah, easy money staying here," it just had a 300-point swing, and it was up about 200 points.
Yeah. The fact that when you just speak, whether you're telling the truth or you're just trying to sugarcoat the markets, the different, and that's why it's hard to believe those sources of information, those numbers. So the fact, when you mentioned the job numbers, the fact that all-time high, Great Depressionary type of unemployment as of last March, and still to this day there's a lot of unemployment, underemployed as well as another category, and as well as those that have left the job force because they're no longer counted, but yet they'll come out with a figure saying a couple 100,000 is now in the workforce. It's like, okay, well, but you still got those multiple millions that never came back into the workforce. So did you really create new jobs, or are that's people going back to their old jobs? And are they actually working from home or actually in the office type of category? So yeah, it's hard to really trust the information we're being given these days.
So let's shift to a broader topic of currencies, which is your forte. Your publication, Rethinking the Dollar. It's an educational portal on pretty much everything wrong with the good old buck and the broader fiat currency empire. As you say, quote, "The United States dollar is being challenged as the world reserve currency, and several countries have begun to wean themselves from using the dollar." Now, this has been apparent with the de-dollarization push by Iran, Russia, China, and others. And as a quick plug, Liberty Nation has reported this extensively over the last couple of years. The digital yuan is looking to gain prevalence, while the latest IMF numbers point to the dollar's shrinking ubiquity. Looking ahead, is the global economy adopting a new monetary system, or the power simply shifting to a new international reserve currency that still depends on the fiat mechanisms of the post-Bretton Woods system?
Oh, great question there. And so I would imagine that based upon all the events that's transpiring right now, it's not too hard for people to believe that we are currently in a reset. And so once again, last summer, we had the IMF director come out and said that it's time for a new Bretton Woods 2.0 type of movement, which to me was a signal that they've already established plans to move away from the dominance of the dollar as a world reserve currency. And, for good reason, of course, because I think the U.S. has abused the privilege of having the world reserve currency by running continuous deficits basically yearly for the last 20 plus years, it seems. So yeah, the Federal Reserve note, as it's been known, is definitely in the process of being rebranded. And so we have the CBDC talk now, which is the next version of what I believe the Federal Reserve note will be transferred into, which will be a centrally controlled digital ledger type of project that will operate whether in collaboration with the Treasury and Fed. No one quite knows yet. But then we're seeing around the world, all central banks now are transitioning to some type of central bank digital format to issue as a legal tender at some point. And so the Federal Reserve note is one of many currencies that are having problems, and they're intentionally looking to rebrand them and basically come up with a new way of handling the international trade outside of the dollar at some point. And I think the long-term role of these CBDCs will to make them interoperable to where the ultimate goal at the end of the line will probably be some type of one world currency, which is a part of this whole, globalist agenda, I believe, that's underway now. So Federal Reserve note is on its last leg, I believe. And, and pretty soon within the next 10 to 15 years, I think we won't be talking about this conversation as far as the reserve currency being solely in one nation's hands. So I think it's underway right now.
So finally, if there is a transition where the dollar is no longer king, let's say the yuan is now the international reserve currency, or as you say, some one world currency, how much would this alert the global economic infrastructure? And if, let's say, those currencies do become the top kings of the world, how would this impact a student, a retiree, or middle-class worker? What happens to the average person?
Great question there. And so in this transition, unfortunately, based upon prior monetary resets or the end of empires from prior years, I'd like to use those as examples. And so, of course, Weimar Republic was a situation where, due to extreme inflation, i.e. hyperinflation, in the midst of a currency devaluation, anything priced in that currency tends to lose, or the holders of those assets tend to lose out because the price valuations of those assets are extremely distorted. And so most likely people who save in that national currency are the ones that come up short because they're basically being robbed of purchasing power. And so the actual ability for you to go out and get your daily goods and needs disappear. And so all the pensions, all the liabilities, retirement funds, you name it, are all denominated in currencies that are usually inflated away to where the purchasing power is stolen from the people. And it's a very sad occurrence that occurs often throughout history, but yet they end up being losers. So savers and current retirees tend to lose in environments where extreme inflation robs them of purchasing power. So it will not end up pretty. And just there's more than enough examples around the world when currencies end, how it basically robs its citizens. So we got Venezuela, Zimbabwe. Those are nations that are not reserve currencies, but similar situations where the governments are over indebted and they basically look to restart over by destroying the currency and come out with some other new form. So
yeah, the Turkish lira and the Argentine peso, they're the next currencies that seem to be going through a crisis.
Right.
Also, as to your note earlier about hyperinflation, it's interesting that the Bank of America recently warning about transitory hyperinflation. That should be something to look for.
Right.
So, so in the end, despite warnings from conservative and libertarian economists, it seems like the US dollar can withstand anything at this point. But then, as you say, you look back through history and study the debasement and depreciation efforts of empires worldwide, and your only conclusion is that the dollar's demise is inevitable. So on that note, I would like to thank Mike of Rethinking the Dollar for appearing on this special edition of Swamponomics. You can find him at Rethinking the Dollar, and you can watch his enormous catalog of videos on YouTube, interviewing a wide variety of guests with different opinions on the topics of the day. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me on your show. Appreciate you.
So that's it for me this week. Please read my full Swamponomics column and check out my normal video edition of Swamponomics, where I dive into the broad array of issues affecting the US and global economies.
Thank you.
Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.